Okay, welcome to this week's Community Archives lecture. So this is Community Participation Part 2, the second and final part of our exploration of community participation and as it relates to archives. So here are weekly topics for this week, pretty similar to the ones that we looked at when we discussed community participation earlier on in this course. So I'll just kind of leave it at that. I'm going to start by talking a little bit more about participatory archives and going back to this idea that we've discussed in this class before, that if there are official records connected to an individual or personal records connected to a community or communities, that the individuals or communities represented in those records ought to have some say in record-keeping decisions surrounding those records. And this is similar to the view that Indigenous Australians have when it comes to archival records related to them. This is something that the McCamish article discusses on page 19. So McCamish notes that Indigenous views on archival records view the records as being part of their records. So the Indigenous view is that if a record is related to me, it's my record, and I should have some say over record-keeping decisions surrounding that record. And of course, this is different from the traditional institutional view of provenance and creatorship and the power that is tied into that. So McCamish notes that archives that have received records about Indigenous Australians view them as documents of government operations and feel that those records belong to the government. So the article discusses the tension between those that feel that records need to be amended and those that feel that records should not be tampered with. So Indigenous Australians may feel that the records do need to be amended so that their perspective and their voice is heard within the records, and institutional archivists feel that the records should not be tampered with and that there should be no participation by Indigenous Australians that is attached to those records. In the McCamish article, the authors propose an archive that does a few things that incorporate this idea of participation by Indigenous Australians, and particularly the Koori community, which is the focus of this article. So McCamish and their co-authors argue for an archive that brings together, integrates, preserves, and makes accessible existing records related to Koori communities, families, and individuals from government, community, and personal sources. So having some way for these records to all be kind of consolidated, if not physically, then perhaps through a website or intellectually in some way. They argue for an archive that caters for content in many different forms and media. So things like oral histories and oral testimony, which is a way that the Koori people have traditionally recorded their memories and communicated with each other, but also written records related to Koori organizations, family and personal records, photographs, audio, video recording. So an archive that really is fairly pluralistic about the types of records that are included in the repository. Another feature of this archive would be that it enables controls and protocols to be negotiated and established that respect the Koori community and the rights of the Koori community and individuals within that community, and that the Koori people have some say surrounding preservation, storage, and accessibility decisions surrounding those records. Additionally, the authors argue for a space in which communities, families, and individuals can easily create and add new content and also in archives that provides a mechanism for annotations that interpret, correct, or provide context for information content sourced from official records. So an archive that is deeply ingrained with the idea of query participation in record-keeping decisions surrounding records that they or their loved ones or community members are represented in. And you can see a variety of ways in which the query people would participate in these records. So by making some of the decisions surrounding storage, preservation, and access that I just described, and we'll talk about more ways that community members can participate in archives later on in the lecture. The main thing to consider when thinking about what the relationship between participation and any archive should be, as McCamish notes on page 221, the needs of the community. So the query people have particular needs related to things that they've experienced in the past, aspects of their culture, and ideally they should be able to participate in archives in a way that meets those needs. So obviously every community is going to be different, and it's up to archivists of all stripes to really engage with community members and try to determine the best way that participation can take place. So the Rushley article describes participatory archives as something that exists at a crossroads of community archives, public history, and institutional repositories. So when we discussed community participation before, we talked about mediated archives, less mediated archives, and unmediated archives, and how participation will be a part of these archives to different degrees. So in a mediated archive, participation by people represented within the records may be quite small. It may be non-existent. I've decided to be generous here, and illustrate some at least limited participation. Maybe I'm being an optimist, but mostly it's going to be the voice of the archivists and of the records creators that are going to make a determination about record-keeping decisions surrounding the record. In a less mediated archive, participation, at least ideally, is more of a factor in record-keeping decisions. And while there may be an archivist and the archive may have some mediative role, some authoritative voice, it's going to be lessened in a less mediated archive. And in an unmediated archive, there is as the name implies, no mediation at all, and it's all participation by community members. So aspects of participation can exist in all three of these archives, but to varying degrees, just kind of depending on the type of the archive and the particular circumstances related to the archive and the community that the archive represents or has some relationship with. So last time we discussed participatory archives and community participation. We talked about how the representation of loved ones, the representation of community members, the representation of physical spaces, and the representation of events through participatory archives can be forces that support the formation and enhancement of identity, how this participation in these varying types of representation can support and enhance identity. And this is something that our readings for this week touch on as well. So the Rushley article on page 3 talks about how crowdsourced archives can provide a deeper understanding of sources due to new knowledge and unexpected discoveries, and how this can how they can disrupt power relationships in and around archives. So not only can crowdsourced archives make representations of loved ones, community members, and so on be more deeper and more nuanced as new knowledge and unexpected discoveries develop through participation, but this can result in a resulting reduction in the power in and around archives. So as community members are able to provide more nuanced and representative representations of loved ones, members, and physical spaces and events related to their community, that diminishes the role of the archivist, because the archivist isn't the sort of the sole provider and arbitrator of information. The information is provided by a decentralized set of community members and not by one or two archivists. And through this participatory process, Rochely talks about how larger histories become local and communal through connections to the participants. So the Rochely article talked about representations of the Holocaust and some other events, and having this participation can take an event that that may seem well beyond the bounds of a geographic location or a single community, and really connect it to that community and connect it to that geographic location. And again, this can provide a much more nuanced and reflective portrayal of a community and how it lived through and surrounded, how it lived through and experienced the events that surrounded it. And I think you can make some connections between this and the idea of postmodernism. So it may be that a community experienced an event or is able to represent themselves or a physical space that is related to them in a way that may be quite different from the accepted norm or from meta-narratives that exist in society. So through the diversification of perspectives that can result from participatory archiving, it can allow for the creation of new narratives which may conflict with narratives that are present in history books, narratives that are supported by the government, these meta-narratives that we talked about earlier on in this course. So there are definitely some connections here with postmodernism and postmodernist ideas. Related to that, Rochely notes on page 14 about how a shared authority on history can involve implicit and sometimes explicit dialogue from very different vantages about the shape, meaning, and implications of history. So again, all these different types of representation may conflict with each other. So members of a community discussing a physical space may conflict with each other. They may conflict with sort of the accepted norm about a community or a physical space or an event. Where there is openness, where there is nuance, there's a lot of room for people to disagree with each other and to come to conclusions about how history took place, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. Looking at some of these different types of representations more closely and how participatory archiving can impact them and support the formation and enhancement of identity. And the Greenhorn chapter for this week, the author talks about how community participation can correct the vision of a community presented through language and imagery used by non-community members. So the author talked about the replacement of native types with correct community designations as a part of the project naming endeavor that Library and Archives Canada engaged in. So when we're talking about representation of community members, representation of loved ones, this community participation is going to result in a representation that, isn't very broad and bland and inaccurate and insulting, but rather one that does respect the identity of the people represented in photographs. And that's certainly something that is going to help other members of that community feel more of a connection with their past, and through that connection feel an enhanced sense of identity. On page 19, the Rochely article talks about how participatory archives can help situate the importance of physical spaces through communities, and how physical spaces serve as a context for memory. So as these representations for physical spaces are developed through participatory archiving, it can help community members have more of a sense of their community's history and their community's past. And that's certainly something that can help community members form and enhance their sense of identity as well. On page 217, the McCamish article notes the need for Indigenous Australians to reclaim their identity by knowing their family background and reconnecting with the places and cultures of their people. So if participatory archiving and community participation again allows for a much more in-depth representation of loved one and of community members, that's something that can support the identity of people whose loved ones and community members may have been erased from history prior to participatory archiving taking place. The McCamish article also notes the desire by Indigenous Australians to tell stories of separation within Indigenous communities and wider Australian and the wider Australian community as well. So when you're talking about representation of events, if events have been depicted in a way that doesn't reflect all the nuances and truths of an event, then participation by community members who were impacted by those events can provide a much more truthful and balanced perspective of those events. And, by saying this was a part of our community's history, it can provide community members with a better sense of what their community has experienced, a better sense of the community's past, and an increased awareness of the identity of their community and the events that community has experienced. Without this form of community participation that does provide additional context to historical events, there might be whole aspects of a community that even the community members themselves aren't aware of until this participatory intervention takes place. So what I wanted to do this week was to talk about how the act of engaging in participatory archiving can support the formation and enhancement of identity, and also how the results of participatory archiving can support the formation and enhancement of identity as well. So first we'll look at how the act of engaging in participatory archiving can support the formation and enhancement of identity by community members. So on page 12, Rochely talks about personal connections as being the lens through which participants see and understand history. And I feel like being involved in participatory archiving can really help people develop these personal connections, and through them have more of an understanding of the past that they and their community have gone through. And so that's certainly something that can help them develop their identity. On page 18, the Rochely article talks about membership and belonging, and how membership and belonging can evoke affective states that the author sees illustrated in the participant stories of their communities. The author describes seeing interviewees reach a feeling of belonging in a variety of ways. So doing things like developing personal relationships with other people, developing a sense of belonging through shared circumstances, developing a sense of belonging through connections to physical locations. And Rochely notes that these various connections can inform an individual's sense of self, a sense of ideas, and a sense of group and individual identity. So as community members participate in archiving, and as their sense of belonging in a community continues, it can allow them to, or it can help them form deeper connections with their individual sense of identity and their community their sense of community identity as well. Rochely notes on page 16 that participatory archiving can help support the formation and enhancement of identity, again, by fostering a sense of community belonging that helps individuals feel like a part of a larger collective. And this goes back to the idea of representational belonging that we've talked about in class. So this sense that I belong and that we belong in society. On pages 6 and 7, Rochely notes that participatory archiving can embed individual memories into the framework of a community, thus enriching the community of memory that supports community identity. So the wider and greater participation that takes place, the stronger this community of memory, the stronger a community of memory will be. And Rochely, quoting Ketelaar, feels that this community of memory is something that can serve as a strong foundation for community identity. So all these memories are developed and connected to other memories through participatory archiving, and that provides this rich web of a community of memories that supports the sense of identity that a community can develop by being able to interact with these memories in some way. And again, these memories may not have existed if it wasn't for participatory archiving and all the nuances that it can provide. I think also that participatory archiving can contribute to a sense that a person has a history in a community. So if I'm able to record an oral history about my family's experience in a community, that can really help me understand the way in which I belong to a community and the sense in which my community belongs to society as a whole. And so this also goes back to this idea of representational belonging. This sense that I have a history in this community, and this community has a history within society. So just being able to participate that and to contribute to the community of memory that we talked about before, I think would be a very affirming act that would help someone feel more strongly connected to who they are and how they fit in with their community. So to talk a little bit about how an accurate perspective of a community developed through community participation can increase someone's sense of identity and help them feel more of a connection as a person and to their community as well. The Rochely article on page 19 talks about how participatory archiving can provide additional context to existing records, can add layers of meaning, extend viewpoints, and relay the emotions of participants. And Rochely notes on page 12 that personal connections are the lens through which participants see and understand the past. And participatory archiving, with the nuance and context it can provide, provides a greater opportunity for people to see and understand their past and the past of their community as well. So the more layers of context and meaning and viewpoints and emotions that are added to the history of a community, the more capable a wider number of people can be of seeing their experience and themselves represented in a community and in a community's past. And again, that's something that can really help people feel a sense of identity and a sense of connection to a community. Related to that, Rochely describes participatory archives as serving as a bridge between personal and communal pasts. So serving as something that it can extend from my sense of as a person to a community, and through that, something that can make me more aware of my identity as a community member. On page 218 in the McCamish article, the authors note that community influence record-keeping decisions can move archives away from practices that reinforce settler and colonial voices and negate indigenous ones. So in a lot of ways, archives that do reinforce these settler and colonial voices and negate indigenous ones are not going to serve as good bases for the formation and enhancement of identity, because the identity of Indigenous Australians may not be represented in that archive at all. If it's an archive that is full of the perspective of people that are not part of the Indigenous community, then it may be unlikely that there's going to be any nuance or complexity within those archives that accurately portrays Indigenous people and the things that they experienced. And obviously this can have implications for the ability of Indigenous Australians to form and enhance their identity. If you have been symbolically annihilated, if you don't see yourself in history, it can be more difficult for you to get an understanding of who you are and where you came from, and what your community has experienced and how that has shaped you and your community today. So having talked about participatory archiving and how participatory archiving can support and enhance identity, let's talk a little bit more about some of the ways in which community members can participate in the formation of social memory through participatory archiving. Excuse me. So the Flynn article talks about community members making corrections, sharing information, asking questions, and making suggestions for donations. So those would be ways that community members could participate in archives. And again, the goal here is to develop a archive or a memory project that that is more nuanced and allows for more information to be available and present in social memory. The chapter on project naming had quite a few examples of how community members could participate in that particular project. So social media was listed, so communicating through social media to help shape the understanding of Indigenous communities. Through photo ID sessions led by field workers in consultation with community elders, so community-based events. Through the collaboration with other community-based initiatives, through research done by Indigenous researchers, also through the creation of an advisory council consisting of community members and cultural heritage professionals. So a variety of ways in which Library and Archives Canada attempted to facilitate the participation of Indigenous community members in the identification of members of their community. The McCamish article discusses on page 223 identifying participants in record-keeping decisions. So the community itself should really have a lot of influence in determining who within their community is best able or should be given the power to participate in record-keeping decisions. So last week we talked a lot about how can archives determine who are the best people to make record-keeping decisions about a particular record or a particular set of records. And we'll revisit that in just a minute, but one good solution might be to, or probably the best solution would be to consult with the community members themselves. Since they know their community, they know who has the strongest connection with particular aspects of the community, so they would be in the best position to make these participatory decisions. The McCamish article also talks about the creation and metadata of descriptive systems that contextualize records as co-created by participants and the transactions that they document. So facilitating a way for metadata to indicate that records have been co-created by participants. And also on page 232 by placing oral versions of events alongside the official records. So providing some counterbalance to official records that are communicated in a way that is a part of Koori tradition and Koori culture. So to go back to the discussion that we did have last time when we talked about community participation, about the different levels of participation and who ought to be given the power to participate in different ways in record-keeping decisions surrounding records. It's interesting, at least to me, to look at some of the projects mentioned in our reading this week and try and discover how they correspond with Roland's thoughts about types of participation and who should be participating in them. So looking at the Massachusetts Roadshow, it seems like there is a pretty strong connection between the people who are providing oral histories and providing additional context to records and the records themselves. So there really is a strong personal connection. So this would suggest that records related to the events that these different interviews are discussing should be connected to the participants in this project in some way, and that people that are discussing events related to these records should have some power over how these records are maintained over time. I wasn't entirely clear from the descriptions of the project. It seemed like the people who were interviewed for this particular project, the Massachusetts Roadshow, would be either at the experience or identify level. So either they were talking about events and experiences that either they had gone through themselves or that their loved ones or people that they knew had gone through. So that would suggest, at least according to Roland's ideas, that they should be granted or they should be helped to participate in record-keeping decisions on a pretty deep level. So Roeschli notes about how the participants describe the records, provide the context of records, and the context of the community. So this mostly corresponds with the identify level of participation that we have here, in which community members would describe records that they identified with. We could also connect this to appraisal, which is a part of our deepest level of participation, which would be done by people who had experienced events that records were depicting. So by creating oral histories and creating perspectives to be shared within history, you know, that is closely related to appraisal and creation. And it really does seem like that, you know, the people in these interviews do have a strong connection between themselves and the events and spaces and communities and loved ones that they're describing. So it does seem like there's a good match between the participatory power of the people being interviewed in the Massachusetts Roadshow and the level of participation that they have with records that are related to the events that they describe. Next, we'll look at the project naming project that the Greenhorn article mentioned. So it's interesting to know that this was done in a mediated space, Library and Archives Canada, which is the equivalent of the National Archives, only it's in Canada. So this project involves the description of activities, the description of clothing, and places captured in images. There are also some decisions made by Indigenous community members about what to digitize for greater access. So again, I think you can connect this to our experience and identify levels of participation. So certainly some description going on. When you talk about identifying records that should be digitized for greater access, I think that that's a pretty deep level of participation, because there's a strong connection between digitization and access and the likelihood that records are going to be accessed and used in the future. So again, pretty deep and meaningful levels of participation that community members are able to influence. We can also look at the CoLab, which, as Greenhorn notes, was an extension of project naming, and this gave the public the ability to transcribe documents and tag photos online. this will probably be more connected to our relate and research levels of participation. And I think that's appropriate because we're talking about the public here. We're not talking about people that are necessarily related to the indigenous community. And it seems a little perturbing for me that people who may not be part of the indigenous community are able to transcribe documents and tag photos, because who knows how accurately or how respectfully they're doing that. But at the end of the day, it's not as deep a level of participation as that reserved for indigenous community members. So you can see some connections between Roland's levels of participation and what we see in project naming and in the CoLab. Last but not least, we'll talk about the polar bear expedition, which the Flynn article talks about on page 46. So this was an expedition of members of the U.S. Armed Forces during the rise of Bolshevism in Russia. So Flynn describes how participants were able to share information, how they were able to correct errors, ask additional questions, and provide suggestions for further donations. So in some ways, this seems like pretty deep participation. So suggestions for further donations, that seems connected to appraisal to me. Things like information sharing and error correction, additional questions are more shallow, maybe along the research level, but when you're suggesting future records which might be attached or related to the polar bear expedition, that's a pretty deep level of access. And it's not really clear who was able to participate in this project, if it was just the general public, or if it had to be someone who had some connection to the polar bear expedition. But it seems like the participation was pretty open, and in some ways it could be fairly deep. I would say if this was related to a particular community that had been marginalized and misrepresented in the past, I would say, okay, this seems like a bad idea. Because it's related to a pretty minor military intervention, which, in the grand scheme of things, doesn't seem terribly important to U.S. history, or very contentious in U.S. history. Maybe there's less of a concern here as far as the general public being able to intervene in such a meaningful way. So I think it's interesting and helpful to keep this relationship between the level of connection and the level of participation in context. So perhaps this relationship is most important in instances where the records are related to a community that has really been negatively impacted by misrepresentation or a lack of representation in the past. If it's, again, records that are related to a fairly minor kind of footnote in American history, which a lot of people may not really know or particularly care about, then perhaps adhering to this structure isn't quite as important. So that's just something to keep in mind when you're trying to connect levels of participation and the appropriateness of participation with the connections that a particular person has. Okay, and last but not least, we will talk a little bit more about some of the barriers to community participation in participatory archiving. So the Greenhorn chapter talks about the distrust between mainstream archivists and the Canadian government and community members, and how that was something that had to be overcome through building trust. So If you're a member of a community that had had your name taken away, that had been issued what essentially were like dog tags so that you could be identified, instead of being identified as what your given name was, you can understand why there would be a lot of trust and apprehension between community members and Library and Archives Canada. And so that was definitely a barrier to the success of project naming. The McCamish article discusses a possible danger to participants that participate in archiving and in attempting to create and enhance the identity of a community. As I talked about before, this can be a really contentious issue. And if you are agreeing with other community members about how your community should be represented or who should participate in the formation of your community's identity, then that can be something that can cause some pretty inflamed emotions and may lead to people being put in danger and possibly physically harmed. McCamish also noted the difficulty of navigating through participation issues with different community members. So again, with something that is contentious as participation, there's a lot of room for tension and debate, and not everyone is going to agree on which path an archive should take or what participation is going to look like, and that's certainly something that can get in the way of participation as well. More generally, Flynn notes a lack of interest in participation on page 44. So the Polar Bear Expedition project eventually just kind of petered out because there weren't a lot of people that were participating. So that's obviously a big concern. If you're offering the chance to participate, everyone just kind of shrugs and says, yeah, that's going to cause problems. I think that a really big one is infrastructure, which we talked about before. If you look at the ideas that McCamish and their co-authors have about what a truly participatory archive should look like, that's a lot of moving pieces to be able to somehow consolidate or provide access to all these records, to set up different access strategies and storage strategies and preservation strategies for different records, to provide some way for community members to annotate records and provide additional context to records. That's something that can provide a lot of work and a lot of infrastructure that even traditional and mainstream archives may not have, let alone community archives. So just the complexity of participation, the complexity of true, deep, and wide participation can be something that can really get in the way of fully participatory archiving and really deep and meaningful community participation. Okay, so we'll call it a day there. I just wanted to provide some additional details about community participation and participatory archiving, and to try and connect some of our case studies for this week with some of the guidelines or thoughts about community participation that we discussed last week, and talk more about the impact that community participation can have on a community's identity and a person's identity as well. So hopefully this has provided some useful additional information for you. As always, let me know if you have any questions, and we'll talk off and on about community participation throughout the rest of this course, but I do think that given how important it is, especially to community archives, it's a topic that you really can't think and discuss enough. So hopefully this additional discussion has been helpful for you, and you have more of an idea of how you might facilitate participation either as a mainstream archivist or as a community archivist in the future.